All right, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Today's video is something a little bit on the special side because you could basically call it both a superpower and then more also a resource. Because some characters can essentially have this power, and others require some type of accessory, so to speak. And the such power would actually be that of time travel. Now, this is possibly one of the most controversial powers you could ever have because, you really can't really talk about it too much because if you say, you know, because everyone will want you to fix everything, um, for them. And in this case, it's like, well, what exactly are they going to do? Because you have to kind of go to a vicious cycle. If someone finds out, you got to go back, figuring out what exactly, caused, them to figure out and then back and forth. It's kind of like how in the series Heroes, Hiro Nakamura always talked about the too many butterflies, and yet he was pretty much publicly identified as the master of time and space. I'm like, that seems like a counterintuitive anything. And and you never really know what kind of time travel experience you might get. If you're going, you know, into the future, you could be dangerously overwhelmed by say whatever you see, or it could be very disappointed. It's like, you know, going, 100 years into the future, thinking it might look more like the Jetsons. All it really might look is just a little bit shinier version of whatever we have. At least by going to the past, you kind of have, things to kind of brush up on. That way you could essentially, um, so you kind of know exactly what you're going to do. But the problem is that if you're talking about, time traveling, like using like the DeLorean from Back to the Future, you don't really travel too much in space. It's not like you go through a time tunnel. So in theory, whatever could be right in front of you isn't affected, like what happened in the first one, where essentially Marty runs into a actually runs right his head into a scarecrow, then leads to old man Peabody's barn. But then in part three, he thought he was just gonna, he literally rides right into the essentially Indian troop, right where right at the theater that he went through. It's like, oh, they're not going to be there. And it's like, yes, there is. But, it eventually did kind of work out because, in the end, just because when they had to basically go off the bridge, in the present, basically back in 1885, it was still being built, but it was already built, completed long before 1985. So Mario was able to kind of ride on that. But because he was on the rails, it wouldn't be anything like you would be able to avoid hitting the train and destroying the time machine. Let's say like Doc originally wanted. I said, but if you're part like of a like time traveling cop scenario, and that's where you go, and you really can't, find some way to just, activate the hover function. I said on the DeLorean in such a way that it's like up there it goes, and even like turn on the stealth system, so no one would even see anything at all. That's definitely going to be a problem. And you could also would say is that, it's a little hard to kind of pin everything kind of down because when they actually showed Indiana Jones 4, they made it seem as though there was some kind of overall continental drift. So in theory is that you may say this is the part where you are um, in time at the specific moment. But if you were to travel back in time, in theory, the world essentially will have shifted, so it's there. It might as well be the equivalent of putting a dot on a balloon, and when you blow it up, it definitely, said it definitely changes. It's still relatively in the same spot, but if you put more, like a second dot, they actually get much farther apart, and that could definitely be a bit of an issue. Then you never know what exactly would it take to actually use, to naturally time travel. Someone like the Flash may be able to definitely, can time travel, but the fact of the matter is, you, you know, it's and then again, the whole movie itself made it seem as though like he no longer needed food after a certain point, but it was just the fact that he kind of had to manually run through time to reach a certain point, it said in the past, and then move so much, back into that. But and then you never really, then even he wasn't fully aware of what exactly was supposed to happen to him at the point. So that's another really big issue, and a truly dark conspiracy about Back to the Future is the fact that Marty essentially murdered his entire family because they're not the family he left, and he doesn't have any real memory because essentially you're taken out of time at when you travel. There's not, in theory, it's that you're almost as you enter alternate timelines. So while in this case he still may have had the photo of his brother and sister to kind of work with, the fact that the house looks so much better, I said brother and sister are far more successful in life. The parents don't look as pathetic. And then even at one point they pointed out that the beer that was actually used was actually a higher quality of beer because George is actually living so much better. But they never really said exactly what was supposed to happen with Marty, and then with actually part two, when Marty shows up, it's like you're supposed to be in Switzerland, and what would ever have happened if Biff essentially called you know Switzerland and said, yeah, your son is right here at this. So you almost kind of need to have some type of temporal stabilization, kind of like what they showed in the butterfly effect, but just the fact that essentially, it seemed like using that stuff too much time would cause, um, your mind to basically turn to jelly because almost as though you have to be, because the more you have to change, um, the more, the more stress it's going to have instead put on your thing. Because that's definitely one thing you always have to worry about is if you have to change something, you got to make sure you know how to adjust with it. I'm not saying that there isn't some kind of way for the power, so basically some kind of temporal idea to work a little bit differently, almost like if kind of like how they always make it seem as though like the old school like Red Scare. It's like this is what you would have been like if Russia took over. In theory, is that you could have some buffer time, like going to bed for a good while, in the fact that you start remembering, you know, your old timeline, and then here's the timeline with you. So it may not really be it may not be entirely too dissimilar, like the idea of, parents are getting divorced and you choose one of them. And on one side, you could either see, um, this is what happens if you stay with your dad. This is what happens when you stay with your mom. And you never know what kind of, so it's kind of like you're able to kind of see both sides, you know, so that if you can basically make the decisions. In theory, it's like saying, if you go with your dad, maybe your mom will do quite as well because she doubts herself in one area, but yet if you saw the timeline with your mom, the same thing that she doubted is actually pretty successful. And they actually had a series many years ago called Awake with Jason Isaacs, where he pretty much was in this weird kind of dreamlike state where in one reality, um, his son died in a car accident, and the other side was his wife died in the exact same car accident. So he's able to kind of bounce back, and some things were able to kind of help his job as a cop, and then other things, like one of the big thing was the fact that before the son died, he fathered a grandchild with someone. So in one reality where the son's there, girlfriend actually miscarries, but when basically both parents are left, she actually wants to have the baby and bring it to full term. It's like, yeah, we want to actually, be grandparents, so it just kind of, the back and forth could be there. But he could also would say this also works in the fact of like an entire time loop. where certain events that would cause, time to be skewed have to eventually would essentially what happened. So if you went back in time to that caused something, and it said you could see that you would essentially would have to progress to a certain point, and then if that doesn't no longer happens, then essentially, time would in theory reset itself. So it's kind of hard to maybe, you know, entirely like go for everything, because it's one thing for the fact that Marty essentially, was eventually, did end up finding, Doc Brown, like alternate Marty found him, and that's what happened. So essentially that would be there. But when they kind of showed, like in Back to the Future Part 2, it makes it seem as though that Doc actually had to spend many, many years actually trying to build the time machine. So in theory, is that after some point, unless Biff had the time machine built in secret, eventually time would say, oh, there's no way to actually, eschew this reality. So this, kind of junction tangent point will eventually just kind of revert back to its original self. And whether or not anyone fully remembers everything is quite a mess, because the idea is just the fact that you still have to kind of create everything. If you're talking about what happened in Avengers Endgame, they made it seem as though that essentially Captain America was actually able to put his entire all the Infinity Stones back where they were supposed to go. But in theory, all he really ever had to do in secret was essentially not immediately be brought into back to his moment. Almost as though if there was like if he was smart enough to realize, okay, this is the off switch, so I can have the life I was supposed to have with Peggy Carter all those years, and it said I'm just awkwardly in the background. So as long as no one really um, associates who he really is, everything can be fine. Although this was kind of messed up in the movie because Captain America actually liked having a secret identity. But if in this case, you've been back, so many times, said they would kind of would notice everything. But it's like, hey, why does Peggy Carter's husband look a lot like Steve Rogers? you know, so it doesn't really make much sense, if you can see everything. It's like, why would two people be in the same place at the same time and actually not be related? Because that Asian guy that was actually in the first, like the first Avenger movie, his grandson became, Spider-Man's principal. So in theory, it's like you can, use that kind of trope where it's like, yeah, you literally, like your grandchild looks literally just like you, but it's made it seem as though they kind of put Captain America was too publicly known facially wise, so it really wouldn't take too many people to realize how what exactly did he do in the past, and they never really meant really dive too much into it, mostly because they went for all the other trashy story arcs. So it's like the big question you want to know, you don't get answered and probably never will unless enough people complain. But so that's definitely another thing. And one thing you may also would need to consider if you're talking about using something kind of like an individual like DeLorean, or even some other basic vessel that you end up at a certain point, is that you definitely want to make sure you know how it's powered and have an immediate way to recharge and rebuild in case even the slightest miscalculation. It makes it seem as though that in Back to the Future Part One, when they just reloaded, one kind of thing, it makes it kind of makes it seem as though it's like the way they kind of show like the actual fuel storage thing. It looks like they would have like a series of cartridges, so that would just be loaded like a bullet, and that's how it would be. That's yet, but yet, they didn't really think to anything to even kind of keep the plutonium in a certain location after the first test was successful, and essentially, um, so that's the whole big deal about actually using the lightning bolt issue. Although, as many people actually would say, well, when exactly the exact time the lightning bolt was supposed to actually hit may have been predicted anytime, between just said after midnight, or I forget exactly what it was, maybe after 11. But the idea was just the fact that, their lightning travels insanely fast, and you have 60 full seconds to possibly gauge it, unless someone was there to say this was the exact time, and that could definitely be an issue, could definitely be a problem. And while in this case, Mr. Fusion was definitely very helpful in the sequel, the fact that no one even noticed that Biff actually used the time machine, it's like, hey, I thought I just refilled this stuff. It's like, or even some like, time odometer. It's like someone just used this, he said, and they saw like Biff's broken cane, in this thing. It's like, okay, we know exactly what happened. So we got to find Biff in the past to figure out how was it what he did, and he just never kind of he never just kind of this that always just kind of bothered me, and then so it's just like, they were just prepared for everything. And then even if the Libyans, did maybe showed up a few minutes later, it's like the fact that Doc didn't want to just immediately prepare for his, journey. Instead, it's like, yeah, this is how everything is there. Said, I'm actually going to go see, probably would go, maybe into the future just because, so maybe see if there's another alternative way to actually, um, it said, power this thing so we don't have to use plutonium. So, but a lot of people may actually be more familiar with the time traveling antics of Doctor Who, and I fell in love with that show as a kid. Although because it was on PBS, they actually just aired it as one big kind of like movie. I said rather than like the individual episodes with the opening and ending credits. So I didn't actually realize that as a kid, this was actually one big continuation, and the reason and to get a new actor, they just essentially make him regenerate. And I actually saw regeneration as a kid, along with characters like Sarah Jane Smith and the Brigadier and Davros, but didn't really put things together because I was like 5. But and while in this case he is definitely able to travel quite a bit, you know, all across the universe, it always makes it seem as though that you never just go to a place, and just feel fine. And so they did show like the Matt Smith era that essentially, the TARDIS always took him to where he was needed. But I'm thinking, yeah, but if you're going to be literally raping the fabric of time and space, you got to at least give them, a few days, just to recover. Because and so with the whole keys to time story arc, the Doctor was saying K9 said it's finally time we're going on holiday, and yet it makes it seem as though he never actually went anywhere because he was immediately thrown into such a. I mean, it's one thing for him to basically just go someplace and then have a fair amount of time, um, maybe in between seasons, um, to maybe give him that quiet life that he's always wanted. But he's still somewhat, you know, curious about where he wants to actually go at his next one, and it's always just kind of seemed kind of strange that, even if he wanted to actually do something very casual, like or go to a specific place, it wasn't ideal because when they actually showed, like in the series, in the serial, The Girl Who Waited, they essentially went to the second most popular planet um, in the universe, and but when they got there, there was a dangerous plague that would kill you within 24 hours, and even the Doctor was going to be affected by it if he went into the wrong area. But yet, um, in which Amy ended up going into the wrong room and basically spent 34 years waiting to be rescued. And said, but yet there was another version of her that said, yes, we can get there, but it just always just kind of seems sad that but when he finally does go there, it's like, yeah, shit hit the fan because you rarely do get to see the Doctor go back to certain planets um, in many capacity. I mean, Earth is always fine, but he's ended up on Skaro a couple of times by accident. He did eventually return to Telos with his Cyberman's help. Um, Metabilis 3 from, or at least would say it talked about the Green Death, and then back in the final, John Pertwee's final big episode serial of the Planet of Spiders, um, essentially when he first, essentially did go there and was actually able to lock in the coordinates, but it seems like, yes, you're able to get there physically, but the total amount of time could still be a bit on the more dangerous side. You could possibly chalk it up to maybe saying that's was manipulation of the Time Lords, but if in theory this was, earlier parts of the first and second Doctor's thing, you really wouldn't just be able to go back and forth. It didn't really seem like he was able to go back and forth. The only time, or although because of the missing episodes, it might be a little hard to figure things out. But I would definitely would say is that the one time he actually had to go went immediately back to the same location was in a serial called The Ark, in which he and his two companions are there, and sadly one of them actually has a cold, and all the people on the space age colony haven't really gotten sick in who knows how long. So she needs some kind of medicine, and everything seems fine. I mean, he's able to, see that, okay, yeah, we're going to this new planet to colonize everything. We're building the statue to represent, um, it's almost kind of representing the progress. And then when it was there, but when the doctor, it said, immediately gets there and sees sees the completed statue, it's not of a human. It's of a creature known as a monoid, which was this kind of weird creature that had one eye that was conveniently located in the actor's mouth. And at first they couldn't actually talk, but then they had this weird cardboard prop that essentially allowed them. They were able to kind of poke around, but it seems like they were immune to the after effects of instead of even just like the common cold, and they were able to enslave the said humans. So you just never know exactly how you're going to get back to a certain place with time travel like that. And then other incidences kind of eventually would show that you have to be part of it. So, I said one thing was actually the doctor uh, essentially caused the Great London Fire just because he defeated an enemy, and that was it. And said that conveniently kind of covered their tracks. That made it seem as though that the issue in Earthshock with um, the Cybermen was actually what wiped out the dinosaurs. But the fact that he kind of had to make sure it happened was there. And of course, they made it seem as though that Martha Jones was the first person to shout the word author at a play when William Shakespeare was there. It's like, I guess they do that now. And we also had a moment where it made it seem as though that Matt Smith's doctor accidentally invented a quadricycle while waiting to talk to a version of Claire, and it just seems like, okay, that's one thing, but then again, I actually hated when they had Jodie Whittaker as doctor because she just messed everything up. She just wasn't. She did. They could have had any. They could have had. Could have actually had a lot of her episodes in earlier doctors, and I really wouldn't have noticed a difference. Like when they actually had the fact that she was trying to help Rosa Parks, and just the fact that eventually while she did defeat the cruel alien hunter guy, the fact that they actually had to remain on the bus to actually prevent Rosa from giving up her seat was just kind of a waste in time. And it's one thing to basically have meeting up with various historical figures um, and maybe having a small influence, but rather than just being immediately there, because they actually showed um, that an involvement with the Sixth Doctor actually gave H.G. Wells his inspiration for the time machine. While there was, a moment where, um, 13th Doctor essentially moved into, caused, the inspiration for Frankenstein. It wasn't just because it was like showing the event, the new wave of Cybermen. becoming important again. It was like, really, they couldn't have just shown something else and then worked it in there because, so many, forced choices are there. It's like, because if your enemies will definitely pervert time as much as possible. And essentially said, but the doctor may not. I mean, when he actually tried to rewrite the consequences in the waters of Mars, the fact that he told, someone about, said, oh, you were supposed to die there, is she eventually actually just took her own life. It's one thing to just say, yeah, where I kind of come from, it would say they're not entirely sure of the exact circumstances of how they got off, but you still were able to um, handle something, else and everything was fine. You could have just said, oh, this was another involvement from UNIT, who I actually occasionally worked for, which is fine, but uh, you just really just don't know when and where you're going to go and how much it's going to actually influence. Because it's one thing to just be, out on a random planet where not much really happens, and you said what your involvement eventually causes something, but it's not like, yeah, this is going to happen next week. So that's always going to be an issue. Um, but yeah, so it's one thing to basically, if someone could possibly travel through time, then again, travel through time with the TARDIS, but then they also had like characters like a vortex manipulator that seemed to be a bit more accurate. That's one thing, but you don't want to be the said, but you can still be separated from it. So unless you're actually bound to something, like essentially Hiro Nakamura, it said anyone could just grab your technology, use it for their own issues, and that's it. Because you just never know what else could even be done. Because when they actually showed Heroes Reborn, they literally showed Hiro Nakamura having a wire shoved into his brainstem, so they were actually able to use him to create time portals to um, basically create the utopia of the future after the Earth is just will be destroyed by the sun, rather than trying to actually just fix everything. It's like, we want to play God, and this is how we're going to do it. And until basically his adopted son basically stole his powers by accident, it seemed like all you just had to do was keep everything attached and him sedated, and that's all you could do. And they tried to actually, work it again. It was like, no. It said, we have to find some way of keeping you conscious, and said, in some way, and then we can use your powers again. But eventually got a lot better with actually using his abilities, so that's kind of a double-edged sword. And so it's definitely one thing to go back in time, just to see something, because see events is one thing, but if you were to know what the next lottery numbers are, you could actually predict it. It's like, yes, it said I was the sole whatever, and it just seemed impossible, that there, because you don't want to have one of those family members that would say, well, they always play the following numbers, so those were not related to anything we have at all. It just seems like, and even just like saying, yeah, you may have gotten the basic one, but yet the random, bonus number was just too out of left field for them to actually predict. So they would kind of question everything. And then because they did have a part in Justice League Unlimited where a guy was essentially stealing stuff throughout time, but not really trying to alter it. But yet, um, he eventually took over his own time. He was actually able to take over his own time, just because he eventually was able to acquire the power essentially his wife kind of wanted him to have. But then it made it seem as though he basically imprisoned his mother-in-law, and then, his wife really wasn't all that happy with anything. It's like, yeah, he said the husband is the one with the power. You're just his wife. Okay? It's not an equal, share of everything. Because, yeah, it's just the fact that, it's one thing to go into the future and said, because when they actually went into the future, they found out that, there would be a love child between, Green Lantern and said Green Lantern and Hawkgirl, but It's like we don't want to go too many other things in which they even show the fact that when it said modern Batman met his older form, it said older version, he actually had no memory of ever meeting with this thing. It's like, so you either would say either the older one lied or because time had not been fully set, maybe that's what happened because there was a moment where basically Hal Jordan materialized around John Stewart's body. It's like, yeah, it said it said I'm Hal Jordan. I already know the story. It's just like alternate timeline. This is what happened. And eventually did kind of change back, but then you never know. It's like they actually prevented Diana from even being born. So no Wonder Woman to provide any backup, in the future. So you just never know who or what could even happen. But the last kind of thing I might actually kind of talk about would actually be from Family Guy, because Stewie's time machine definitely seems to be very unpredictable at times, just because one, he has to actually he actually has to have that return pad, every time, and it kind of seems kind of strange that he couldn't make it go both ways. I mean, not until he ripped off Rick and Morty, so it's like, yeah, here we go, so we can go back and forth. But it seems like if the actual time machine itself requires that much of an effort to go there, and yet the return pad is very small, it's like, what I said, how exactly does that work? Does it send a signal throughout time? Does it actually send out throughout time? So the time machine knows how to make everything come back? Because, in theory, it's like someone could actually track it. Because for those who've actually seen Terminator Dark Fate, Dark Fate, you know, the T-1000, the T-800 that killed John Connor, started helping Sarah with her stuff, in secret. And it's like, yeah, I was actually able to detect, the ripples, in time from the time displacement field. And you would think that someone else would definitely be up there to actually um, detect everything. So even before they decided to finally get rid of Bertram, it's like if he was smart enough to actually be Stewie's intellectual rival, then he was saying, well, what exactly is this temp? This thing is like a flow in this space-time continuum. Like someone would notice because when they actually introduce, Stewie's love interest Penelope, it seems like she could have done the exact same thing. Like if you're just intelligent enough, it's like this is actually proof that it's there, and maybe if they kind of thumb through history books, that definitely would seem like they might have accidentally seen someone in a photograph that seemed a little kind of strange, like in Back to the Future Part 3 when they actually showed um, Doc and Marty standing in front of the eventual clock tower, and then there was supposed to be a deleted scene in the first movie where George is actually looking at a thing, and it's like, but it said, and he finally does see Calvin Klein, right there, and looks just like Marty. It's almost like they kind of forgot what he even looked like, but just the fact that it's like it couldn't be. But then we realize it's saying, yeah, I remember when he actually had, his, you know, life raft, a life vest jacket, and it just seemed a little too, strange about that. So eventually, some trace could always remain, so someone could track you. And even then, you're not always guaranteed to have it because it seems like, when the Terminator franchise is, their kind of thing, it makes it seem though it's time displacement. So it's more like instead of going directly into the past, it's like you're going into a version of a past that can branch off into a whole bunch of things. Hence the reason why, you know, John Connor can still exist despite the future where his father grew up, and all the technology that sent him back through time, in theory shouldn't actually exist for a much longer amount of time. Yet, he didn't fade away right after and said for the third movie, which I actually thought was all right. And this didn't really seem to make sense. It's one thing to be marooned in time. So when they showed like evil John Connor coming back as a Terminator, yes, that was definitely an issue. But it seems as though like, yeah, it said it's actually not going to affect the immediate time. We just simply know that it said we have what we need to have to make Skynet better in the past, so it can become, as I said, the juggernaut that it wanted to be. But so you just never kind of know when and where you might end up in time and how everything will be there. Because if you actually think about the TARDIS, it has that iconic, sound when it materializes and dematerializes, which apparently is just only the fact that eventually reveals that, oh, you're just leaving the brakes on. So that's what makes the iconic sound, and is the fact that unless you actually have a proper chameleon circuit, people will definitely notice what a blue police box is going to look like. And the fact that essentially everything is translated around it, it's like, what's a someone could have in theory mentioned it in some part of history that wasn't going to be destroyed. It's like, what exactly is this? So yeah, I mean, time travel would be kind of fun, okay, would be all right to maybe experience once or twice. I mean, in theory, people can claim they can see the future in their dreams, and maybe if you can look into the future, like what happened in the movie Next with Nicolas Cage, that would be okay. But he always says, here's the thing about looking at the future. If you look at it, it changes because you did look at it. So because whatever you were supposed to actually happen right in front of you, is no longer there. So being essentially attacked by something isn't going to happen. Allowing yourself to be attacked, because that's kind of what impressed Jessica Biel's character. So you basically have to constantly keep looking over, said, through everything, and it just makes everything just a nightmare. Because you just never know exactly who you're going to be dealing with. Instead, because if things were sent back in time for a very far thing, someone says, "Oh, we gotta keep the timeline safe. We gotta keep the timeline safe." The fact that you can travel freely back and forth in time means it's never going to be the same. As if anyone's ever seen Power Rangers Time Force, it kind of makes it seem as though that the fact that they never seem to remember themselves in the chronicles of history seem kind of strange. It seems like if there's literally supposed to be you know, a set of Rangers that appear within a few weeks, said, of each other, as said, after one, finishes. It doesn't seem to kind of make much sense that no one would mention anything, because there was actually a moment where they actually had the Great Ranger War in Gokaiger, and yet they did nothing to really kind of prepare for it. And it's almost like if they're saying, yeah, this is actually how we could have allowed the Gokaigers to have the powers to transform into other Rangers, but in theory, this is how both Rangers could almost act at a time. But in theory, that maybe there was some way of saying, okay, as long as one said the Gokaigers have their options, um, the other Rangers will only be at a dramatically reduced set of power, and yet a lot of them were actually technology based, and it just seems like, how exactly could you not keep these things, and how did you not even think to talk to each other, saying, hey, maybe there could be a time when every ranger in history might be needed, and is that if we want to make sure that certain rangers can fight on the same level, because they don't really have like the same kind of team up episodes in Japan. They call it like a versus thing, but it's not like essentially one is directly like totally shows up to help them with something. It's more like they just randomly appear. And it's just like you said, hey, it said thanks for saving me. It said, oh, I said, oh yeah, you're this ranger on this thing. It just always just kind of seems like um, they don't really do too many major like team ups, at least in terms of the main continuity. It always seems to be like a separate movie that is there. So it's not entirely canon, to whatever is happening, in case there's some kind of special power that is there but also isn't. And it can kind of mess with your head. It's not like, here's the big, team of the year. But yet it kind of makes you wonder, about how powerful each generation is, because they made it seem as though that Zeo was supposed to be stronger than Mighty Morphin, and then even that wasn't enough to match the power of Turbo. And yet, when you see the fact that, space comes along, it could be roughly on the same thing. And then you would see like Lost Galaxy fighting along with space. But yet, when they went with Lightspeed Rescue, it didn't really seem like, there was like worrying about someone, not being as powerful as another generation. So it definitely will mess with your head. Not wondering, why someone was warned or even that. It's just like, even if you could have just the smallest of warnings, or just some vague idea of what might actually happen, just so it can be better prepared. Because look at the Cell Saga in Dragon Ball. Trunks was able to warn a it said a shared past about what was going to happen, but he couldn't actually change his. And even then, it's like, okay, I said these were not the androids I told you about. Android 16 wasn't supposed to be there, and who the heck is Cell? So it's just like you think you can change everything, but it's really not going to be the best of anything. It almost seems like what Uncle Ben always said: with great power comes great responsibility. So, the laws of time definitely are probably not meant to be broken for various reasons. So that's going to do it for me. I hope that everyone has a good rest of your week. Enjoy your Labor Day. Um, I said to I said to keep you interested in what's going to be happening next. The next topic we'll be talking about Submariners. I'm not really entirely sure how long that's going to be because there really isn't that much to talk about. But if I figured since it's going to be Comic Talk number 13, you might as well give it an innocuous, topic. And then the one after that will definitely be pretty exciting afterwards. So everyone take care. Please like and subscribe. All right. Bye.